Now, he found that economic theory was wrong, in other words. Now, did he change his textbook? Yes, he did. He didn't even acknowledge his own research in his textbook and continued teaching rising marginal
So this
costs.
guy,
Now,
this guy
is religious.
solved his own.
That is religious. That is not
this guy
scientific.
solved his own problem, and then rather than update
by ignoring his own research. That's not a science. That's not a science. That's a religion.
I wanted to ask you at a broad level, what makes economics fundamentally different from sciences like biology or chemistry, for example?
I think the fact that it has an ideology built into it. So if you look at the development of economics over time, I think it actually went astray right from Adam Smith. In my analysis, Adam Smith sidelined the development that we were going through and trying to understand how human civilization came about. And what we got involved in instead was a war over who produces what, who's responsible for the wealth that we have. And so you had Marx coming out and finally saying workers are responsible for the wealth and capitalists are exploiting workers, etc., etc. And you then got the neoclassical school developing saying, no, it's a cooperative adventure in effect. Workers work to get a wage reflecting their marginal product. Capitalists do the same. The two together produce output, and it's distributed on the basis of merit. And what you get out of that in the neoclassical theory is basically a vision of an anarchist utopia. Because the whole idea of the neoclassical theory is you just draw your supply and demand curves. That is totally independent of the existence of a government. Okay? So, and if any government, if anybody can show government intervention on that supply and demand curve thing, is moving away from the equilibrium, which of course is not good. Okay? So the opening framework is a non-government system. So how can you function with a non-government system? Well, you need a system which is absolutely meritocratic. And that's the idea. Your workers get their marginal product. Capitalists get their marginal product as well. Everybody's being paid in accordance with their contribution. And that becomes a very strong ideological defense of a capitalist economy. Now, it's completely wrong. Okay? It's completely wrong as a model about how people get income. But what it says is fundamentally that a pure market economy with no government intervention, no concentration of power, no unions will still function because the market will coordinate everything, and the market will both let people produce what they're good at and let them consume what they want, subject to the physical resources of the economy. So it actually becomes a vision of a perfect society. Now, as it happens, that perfect society is described by a set of rules in mathematics. So you have a theory this was what the neoclassical did, not the Austrians, but the neoclassical, who followed this school of thought. So they have a model of your consumption, which is based on a concept of diminishing marginal utility. That has mathematical rules attached to it. You then have a theory of supply, which also have mathematical rules attached to it. Now, every time that economists or mathematicians have gone in and tried to examine those rules and say, do they actually reach the outcome the theory says? The answer has been no. Mm-hmm. So one of the very first ones, Walras, who built the first attempt at a large-scale mathematical model of the economy, had this idea of multiple consumers, also being producers, coming to a big market, and they have a whole bunch of things they own they want to sell, and other they want to buy, depending upon what the relative prices are. And so there's this huge auction, and it isn't just like auctioning one thing. It's auctioning hundreds of different products all at once. And you start off with a random set of prices because you might use yesterday's prices as today's, but you have a random set of prices fundamentally. And then there's a person that was called the Walrasian auctioneer, whose job it was to say, well, where demand exceeds supply, the price has to rise, and where supply exceeds demand, the price has to fall. And you make all those adjustments, and ultimately you'll converge to an equilibrium set of prices where the market, in every market, is in equilibrium. Then and only then, in Walras' system, is trade allowed to occur. So that process has to necessarily converge to equilibrium, or nothing will happen in the model. And Walras logically tried to work out, well, if you look at all the diagonals, so you have each market's going to have demand for itself as part of its overall pattern. So you're doing a huge table of numbers, and the diagonal will be the ones where you adjust the price and you affect the price in that market itself rather than some other market. He said all the changes along there go in the direction of equilibrium, whereas all the ones on the other side, off the diagonal, some go towards, some go against. So therefore he thought overall would converge to equilibrium. And he took that idea to the leading mathematician at the time, a guy called Henri Poincaré, who's one of, if you wanted to have the top 10 mathematicians of all time, Poincaré's in the top 10.
So,
and
I just wanted to recap so I make sure I understand. So neoclassical economists assume that the free market is applying these pressures that are constantly keeping us at equilibrium. And
yeah, that's right.
They have these mathematical formulations that don't actually conclude that. Like it doesn't portray the realistic state of the economy, but in terms of what their ideal is, their ideology, we are at a state of equilibrium most of the time, and then there's fluctuations within that. So there's
and mathematically, so the point is that mathematical approach, you can actually set it up as a set of equations in vector mathematics, matrix mathematics, and it depends upon that process that Walras thought would converge to equilibrium was accidentally shown not to by mathematicians solving a problem in pure mathematics in the early 1900s. A guy called the Poincaré and Frobenius were the two mathematicians. So it meant you don't get equilibrium prices. Even if you could get the auctioneer to do what Walras thought the auctioneer did, it wouldn't converge to equilibrium. Now, what that means is the sensible interpretation, prices must be out of equilibrium. But that's okay, because that can explain creativity and capitalism too. You know? But instead, no, we can't do that. So they fudged the result. They literally, they called it the dual stability problem, and they then ignored it. So that didn't work. They thought they could derive a demand curve from individual demand curves, which is what you get taught in the textbooks. That doesn't work. That's what's called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-de-Breuer theorem. So all this stuff didn't work. Now, rather than saying, oh dear, well, maybe things are more complex than we expect, we're out of equilibrium, demand, we have to take into account income distribution, which we don't now models to explain demand, etc., etc. Rather than doing that, they continued fudging. Now, what that meant is a practice of avoiding the direct consequences of logic and empirical data became embedded in economics. And one of my favorite examples of this actually involves Alan Blinder, who's, thank God, hasn't got a Nobel Prize yet, but was he's deputy governor of the Federal Reserve. He was deputy president of the American Economic Association. He did a survey into the cost structure of firms and found that about 90% of firms, rather than having rising marginal costs, which is what all the textbooks teach, they had constant or falling marginal costs. And he actually described that in the book called Asking About Prices as overwhelmingly bad news, brackets for economic theory. Now, he found that economic theory is wrong, in other words. Now, did he change his textbook? Yes, he did. He didn't even acknowledge his own research in his textbook and continued teaching rising marginal
So this
costs.
guy...
Now, that is religious.
That
is religious. That is not scientific.
This guy solved his own problem. And then rather than update...
By ignoring his own research.
I'm trying to...
That's not a science. That's a religion.